I've been playing Undermine over the past few months, and it's been a great game to pop in and out of. However, there are a couple of aspects of the game that might make it not for everyone, so let's get into it. Undermine is a top-down action roguelite with a focus on cross-run progression. You fight through a series of rooms using melee and range attacks, as well as a jump that functions similar to a dodge roll and gives you invulnerability frames. The combat itself feels satisfying, and the dodge jump is fun to use, even if occasionally hard to perfectly control. As you go down floors on each run, you collect upgrades in the form of relics that have combat effects, such as the chance to inflict burning on attack, or out of combat upgrades as well, such as giving merchants more items in their shops. Once you've unlocked them, you can also collect blessings on your run that are more straightforward buffs, such as increased attack speed or throw damage. Undermine has a bit of a passive stacker quality to it, where you try to stack as many positive effects as possible by the end of each run. And you might have 20 or more positive effects that boost your health, damage, or whatever in some way. Together, these effects make your runs feel different, run to run, even though your moveset stays basically the same. Additionally, you can also find potions in each run that you can consume for short-term or one-off effects, such as increasing your attack damage temporarily or spawning a bunch of food that gives you health. You also collect bombs and keys across your run. Bombs can be used for damage in combat or blasting open walls to find secret rooms, while keys can be used to open certain rooms or chests. These add a nice resource management aspect to the game, as well as more potential gameplay options or synergies. And there are relics you can find that modify both keys and bombs, such as certain relics that give bombs special explosive properties. Opposite of blessings I talked about earlier, there are also curses in the game, which often give smaller negative effects, such as decreased attack speed or decreased gold gain. But there are also stronger curses that give bigger effects, such as one curse that makes food poisonous instead of healing you. This curse mechanic goes along occasional item choices, chests, and blessing altars, where you can choose to get a better reward in exchange for some random curse. And this gives a nice risk-reward mechanic to the game. There are also a lot of options and ways to get rid of curses, for some cost of course, so you'll never have a run completely ended by a bad curse. You can also select a familiar or pet for your runs, and these different familiars focus on different mechanics in the game. For example, the starting familiar focuses on collecting gold, and you unlock a more combat-focused familiar pretty early on. So as a whole, there are a lot of different gameplay mechanics in the game to explore. I think the game does a good job of making them all feel fleshed out. They aren't all that deep, but none of the gameplay mechanics feel shallow or tacked on. They're all integrated into the game nicely and come together to make Undermine a fun game to play and explore. Another element that I liked about Undermine are the environment and relic interactions. For example, if you have an item that causes a shock effect and you use it in water, you can shock the water and damage everything within, including yourself if you're not careful. Similarly, you have a Salamander's Tail, which gives your attack a chance to light enemies on fire. You can use that to ignite oil spills or cook your food so that it heals you more. Playing around with these synergies was a fun element of Undermine for me, even if you discover most of the important synergies pretty quickly. It is important to note gameplay-wise that the progression system makes runs feel distinct from a lot of other roguelites. For example, when playing through run in Undermine, there are 5 different bosses to defeat. However, once you defeat a boss in one run and unlock the next area, that boss is defeated for each subsequent run on that difficulty level. So you don't actually have to beat the first boss every run, but rather your goal is to eventually clear each boss across several runs and then progress to the next difficulty level. And once you've unlocked it, you can travel directly to later areas, skipping previously cleared areas entirely, similar to a feature in Spelunky. This isn't always the best move in terms of strategy, because while you do get some items when you skip ahead, you'll always be stronger if you clear all the previous areas and collect items along the way. But still, that's a nice feature to practice future areas, or just skip ahead if you really don't want to play a certain area. I'll dive more into other unlock and progression mechanics later on in the progression section. Now let's talk about RNG and randomness in Undermine. Overall, there is, of course, some important and meaningful RNG in Undermine, but it's not a game with huge RNG influences, either positively or negatively. The biggest area where randomness plays a role is in regard to what relics you find on a given run. As mentioned earlier, these relics can modify your attacks or movements, as well as other miscellaneous effects. Together with blessings, and maybe your pet or familiar, you can create a build based on how these effects stack with each other and synergize. There is enough variety that you don't always get the same thing run to run, and each run does feel different. However, I do think the game is lacking in terms of both build variety and build crafting. And that's probably my biggest flaw with the game as a whole. You get most of your relics by picking them up in locked room on each floor, but it's usually a choice of one. You either take the relic or you don't, and you pretty much always take it because relics are supposed to be positive. Because of that lack of choice, outside of occasionally buying relics at merchants, it really limits your ability to do any of that planning, seeking out synergies, or build crafting that you have in other roguelites. You kind of just take what you get. That said, there are some cool item synergies you can come across, and there are some item pairs that, when you collect both of them, merge together to create a more powerful item that has new effects. However, the item pool isn't that large, especially when you first start playing, and you collect a lot of items on each run if you go all the way to the final boss. What that means is you'll see a lot of the same items frequently, which limits how different each run feels because, you have some of the same relics run to run. And outside of variety for variety's sake, I wouldn't say that the items have a huge impact on the success of your run most of the time. You often don't feel like your luck, what items you get, makes or breaks your runs, though getting certain items at certain times, such as getting a healing item earlier on, can be really beneficial. Another complaint that I have with the items in terms of replayability is that the items rarely affect your moveset, let alone any significant changes. This actually didn't bother me as much as I would have expected, partly because I just liked the base combat, I liked the base moveset, but it's definitely something that's made me want to play the game less after getting a clear or two. It doesn't have that same gameplay variety as some other games because you always have the same abilities regardless of what happens. That said, I do think that the enemy variety is a good point in the game, and some enemies have some unique mechanics compared to others, such as scale enemies gain additional buffs or effects depending on which other scale allies they have around them. Outside of RNG from relics, RNG also affects when you get keys or bombs, what potions you get, and what blessings or curses you get on a certain run. However, these other sources of RNG, besides relics, have more counter RNG measures. For example, whenever you choose a blessing, you always have a choice. You can buy bombs and keys from the shop, so you don't have to rely on just solely getting them when you get them. The map layout itself is also randomized run to run, but that variety serves a little meaningful gameplay difference outside of just not knowing where each thing is run to run. Undermine is very progression focused and progression heavy roguelite, which is where it might turn off some fans of traditional roguelites. Throughout the run, you collect golds from chests or mining gold deposits that you find in random rooms. You can use this at merchants to buy food, items, or relics. At the end of each run, you keep a certain percentage of your gold that you can spend on upgrades. Most upgrades are some form of buff, whether it's increasing your health, increasing how much gold you keep at the end of each run, your swing damage, allowing you to carry more potions, those kind of things. There is a cap to all of these things. You can't upgrade them forever, but you'll have to play quite a while in order to reach the cap for all these different things that you can upgrade. So you're always getting stronger run to run. Because of that, it's a very vertical progression heavy game, in the same vein as Rogue Legacy or Loop Hero. Usually, I'm turned off a bit by games that have that heavy vertical progression focus, but I actually think Undermine handles it pretty well. And I think that's because the pacing of the game and the unlocks is great. It always felt like I was getting a little further, learning some new enemies, and unlocking some new items or potions in each run, in addition to getting stronger and buffed through those unlocks. It never felt like I had to go on farming runs like I did in Rogue Legacy or Loop Hero, which is good, because having farming runs in roguelites is something that really turns me off. There were still a couple times where I had short progression plateaus, where it felt like I kind of stalled out a bit until I got stronger, but this was minimal and only on occasion. There are also some interesting tensions with gold use in the game. Because you can spend gold within a run or save it for permanent upgrades, there are times when you might sacrifice within run strength or health in order to save more gold for permanent upgrades. For example, you might pass up on buying a relic at a merchant in order to buy a health upgrade later on. And that's not a mechanic that I really enjoyed, but after a certain point in time, you get enough gold on each run that it doesn't really matter. In addition to the strength upgrades in various forms, there are also several one-time gold purchases as well, which is a gold purchase that allows you to skip across areas, as I talked about earlier, and a boots upgrade that gives you increased out-of-combat speed. You unlock most of these mechanics pretty quickly though. Additionally, you can also unlock new relics, potions, familiars, and blessings between runs to help you out in future runs, increase your item pool. These unlocks require you to both find new blueprints for the items within your runs, usually in chests, as well as spend a second purple crystal currency to unlock them. You get the second currency from bosses, occasional deposits in room, and certain chests you can find. It has a Dead Cells-like unlocking structure to it, where you can choose which items you want to unlock and add to your item pool, and you always get a test item as well, so you can use that item immediately without having to find it on a run, which is definitely a positive quality to it. It makes that experimentation more fun. This also means that you can choose to never unlock a bad item if you don't want it diluting your loot pool down with a bad drop. Finally, to go along with this progression that strengthens you, there is also a difficulty system. Each time you clear all 5 bosses on a difficulty level, you can play the next difficulty level where the 5 bosses will respawn and all enemies will have a little more health and deal slightly more damage. However, there are no unique run modifiers like you would see in other roguelites. It's just increased health and increased damage. As a whole, Undermine is a progression heavy game, especially in terms of vertical progression. However, the pacing of the unlocks, both vertical and horizontal or more variety focused, feels good. And that pacing may be okay with vertical progression when it otherwise might have turned me off from the game. Now let's talk briefly about the story in Undermine. The game does have some story and world building that unravels as you play the game more, talk to new people in the game, unlock the final boss, etc. It also has some okay character building between the different NPCs, how they talk to each other, how they interact, but it's not really a story-focused game. I like discovering the world when I could by stumbling across secrets, talking to NPCs, but it's probably not a game that's going to scratch that true story itch, which is, to be expected from roguelites, which usually aren't story-heavy games. In addition to the main Undermine game mode that I've talked about in most of this review, there's a secondary Othermine game mode that offers a more traditional roguelite structure. Your upgrades don't carry over run to run, and the bosses and their order are randomized, and the areas, their enemies, and their orders are randomized as well. There are also some big changes to how you receive relics and other items, and there are more counter RNG measures as well in terms of item choices and how you select them that maybe allow for some more build crafting compared to the base game. I played this mode a couple times, and it never really clicked for me. I thought it was fun for variety's sake, but it doesn't feel like it was the main focus of the game, presumably because it wasn't. There are also some weird game structure elements around playing the Othermine mode. What I mean by that is you have to collect a currency through the normal Undermine mode in order to unlock runs in the Othermine mode, so you can't just play it as often as you want to. Also, you have to beat the main game mode in Undermine at least once in order to unlock the second game mode, so if you want that more traditional roguelite experience without having to do all the progression, you can't do that because you have to play Undermine a while in order to unlock Othermine. For example, I think I personally played the game about 15 hours before I unlocked the second game mode. Overall, Othermine is a nice addition to the game, especially if you played Undermine a lot and want a different structure for some more variety. But I don't think that it really offers a good alternative for roguelite fans that want to avoid vertical progression because of limitations with unlocking the mode and how often you can play it. Before I give my verdict on Undermine, let's compare it to The Binding of Isaac, since I've seen many people mention Isaac when talking about Undermine. And Undermine clearly draws some inspiration from Isaac in terms of overarching gameplay elements. For example, the map layout feels very similar when you fight through rooms and clear them in a similar fashion, though in Undermine you can also peek into the adjacent rooms and see what's there. Both games also have a passive stacker nature to them, where you want as many positive effects as possible. Additionally, the functions of bomb and keys feel very similar between the two games, and certain mechanics, such as unlocking secret rooms, could have been directly ripped from Isaac and put into Undermine and you wouldn't have noticed. There are also similar limitations in build crafting, though I think Isaac allows for a little more leeway in terms of making some form of build, as opposed to being subject to RNG to get what you get. The biggest difference between the two games for me are in terms of progression, RNG, and gameplay variety. For progression, both games actually have a lot of unlocks in progression, but Undermine has a large focus on vertical progression, getting stronger between runs, while Isaac has a larger focus on unlocking new areas, items, and characters, more variety and not strength. And because of this, Isaac also has a lot more gameplay variety because it has a lot larger item pools, and also many of the items in Isaac have a lot larger effects on your attacks. In contrast, your attacks in Undermine always feel very similar regardless of what items you have, it's always the same moveset. So which game is better? All things considered, I would consider Isaac to be a better game due to its increased gameplay variety because of the items, characters, enemies, and secrets that you'll find in the game, all of which give it more potential replayability than Undermine. However, Undermine does do some things that might make it better for some people. For example, while it has a smaller item pool, you also have fewer runs ruined by bad RNG. Its focus on vertical progression also makes it more enjoyable for those that want that gameplay element, and it feels more like a journey across runs, while the runs in Isaac feel more independent from each other. I've also found Undermine's combat to be a little tighter than Isaac's, which I think is probably because they're focused on one good, satisfying moveset as opposed to moveset variety. On a smaller note, I've never been a fan of Isaac's art style choices, so the different theme and design of Undermine was more appealing for me for that reason alone. So what's my verdict on Undermine? I had a lot of fun playing through the game. I think Undermine shines most in its fun combat, variety of game mechanics, and their depth, and great pacing of its heavy progression system. It also has an enjoyable story and world that's a nice bonus element, or +1 for the game. However, Undermine isn't a game for every roguelite fan, primarily because of its heavy focus on vertical progression. Additionally, the game lacks somewhat in terms of build crafting and gameplay variety, because you always have the same moveset run after run, and the item pools aren't that large and only have so much impact. Still, if you want a more relaxing roguelite with a larger focus on progression, Undermine is certainly worth checking out. Please like this video to help me on the algorithm, and thanks for watching.